The bizarre intimate lives of white mistresses on the plantation. The owner of the plantation was a woman who was right behind the owner of the plantation in terms of importance. She supervised the work of all the slaves on the plantation. She had great power which she used to exploit said slaves in pure ways. It was inevitable that the private parts of the slaves themselves would be exploited, and that they'd be used to fulfill the lustful fantasies of the plantation owners. Female slaves would be flogged for minor offenses, and their mistresses often left them standing in the field for long periods in the bright sun. From everything attached, it can be concluded that the life of slaves was below any level of humanity, and the life on the plantations is also witnessed by the former slave Harriet Jacobs, the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The slave girl is raised in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The gnash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. When she is 14 or 15, Corona or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped and starved into submission to their will. Dissatisfied wives. Mistresses were privately very dissatisfied with their lives because they were also slaves in a way and had to be obedient and cheerful, while their husbands also had numerous affairs with black slaves from whom children were born. Humanly to become mistresses surrounded, which was extremely devastating for them, and they felt disgusting. They were very bored when their husbands would go on trips for one reason or another, so they had to find an occupation, and then they exploited the slaves in certain ways, which included satisfying their lustful desires. Housewives married their husbands at the age of 15 or 16, and as they grew up, they became more and more lonely and sad. Affairs between mistresses and slaves were much rarer than their husbands than female slaves. Far from intimate relationships between white mistresses and dark-skinned slaves did not occur, they certainly did, but much less was known about them. These relationships happened because women couldn't quite suppress their sexuality while their husbands were on the road. They were sad and lonely, and their burning desires had to be satisfied by someone. They, like their husbands, practiced extramarital gratification of their passions. As one of the dangers of a potential intimate relationship with black slaves was that children of mixed race would be born. At that time, contraceptive methods were not so widespread, but they did exist. Condoms were made from animal skin, oiled silk, and rubber, and along with other contraceptive methods, were used to prevent pregnancy. Intimacy of dark-skinned slave. From her testimony, it is learned that the abuse of the intimacy of dark-skinned slaves was widespread. Mistresses decided on this type of exploitation of slaves sometimes out of pure boredom, and some were very frustrated in the intimate field. So what they could not achieve in other places, they did with slaves. They were not so powerful in other fields of life, so they saw the satisfaction of low passions as compensation for personal failures in other spheres of life. Intimate relationships were also present between white mistresses and dark-skinned men who were slaves. By focusing attention on the ways that multiple and sometimes conflicting sources of oppression and power are intertwined, such an intersectional analysis allows us to make sense of how persons occupying a position of low status in one social arena can simultaneously occupy one of high status in another. Mistresses were often able to force black slaves to have relations with them, and Captain Richard Hinton also spoke about this. I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence I have won who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have a connection with them. The aforementioned Harriet Jacobs also spoke about the way in which the mistresses exploited the intimacy of black slaves. They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases, they exercise the same authority over the men's slaves. I had myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. Housewives were in charge of preserving traditional Christian values and maintaining peace and stability in the household. They were highly valued because they were able to properly take care of the estate in their motherly roles, and because they were virtuous women. Intimate life of the mistresses. As for the intimate life of the mistresses themselves, it was regulated in accordance with the law and the ruling culture. Adultery was punished much more severely when it came to women than it was for unfaithful men. Housewives were also harshly condemned for having children out of wedlock because it was of great reproach for white women, which was not the case when it came to dark-skinned women. White women were attributed to highly moral behavior, especially white women from the upper classes of society, and they were characterized by purity in all fields, including their intimate life. They were supposed to be modest and restrained. Girls on the plantations, things looked very different, and there was not an iota of white women's chastity, which was widely talked about and confirmed by Jacobs. If you want to be fully convinced of the abominations of slavery, go on a southern plantation and call yourself a Negro trader. Then there will be no concealment, and you will see and hear things that will seem to you impossible among human beings with immortal souls. To justify the exploitation of the intimacy of dark-skinned slaves, the story of the chastity of white women and their supremacy in relation to black women, who were synonymous with lascivious behavior, was emphasized. Women from the upper classes gave themselves the right to satisfy their intimate desires in this way, because they considered themselves superior to black women. They also had great frustrations due to the prescribed culture and because their husbands were often absent, so they could not satisfy their lust in the right way. Then they used slaves for that purpose. They had affairs with slaves because of which they suffered great humiliation. It even happened that housewives became pregnant and then made great efforts to conceal the pregnancy. Children of mixed race. Mistresses compensated for the absence of power in their relations with their husbands in their relations with slaves. Scandals that entailed condemnation from society of public humiliation rarely happened, but sometimes they could not be avoided. So children of mixed race were born as the fruit of the love of mistresses and slaves, as testified in his autobiography by Charles Ball, who had an affair with the daughter of a rich planter. The girl was kept in her father's house until the birth of her child, which she was not permitted to nurse. It being taken from her, she was degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery in order to avoid scandals. Infanticide occurred, or children would also become slaves. Planters' wives were supposed to be virtuous and honest girls and to direct all their love towards their husbands. They obviously took their frustrations out on the slaves because they were also a certain type of property of their husbands, who were effectively their masters. Their husbands were allowed to exploit them in the same way as they did with their slaves, and then justifiable frustrations arose. Their freedom was significantly limited, and when they had to travel, they always did so with a male escort. Southern Country Slave Codes. As Low Country Slave Codes demonstrate, female mastery was specifically inscribed into the colony's legislature from their earliest days. 1701 South Carolina law stated that slaves castrated for fleeing their master, mistress, or owner would be further mutilated for repeat escapes, while another from 1740 warned owners failing to provide slaves, under his or her charge, sufficient clothing, covering, or food, they would be held legally responsible. Georgia's laws threatened to fine that master, mistress, overseer of any slave who was hired without an approved ticket. Clauses detailing other civic responsibilities of slaveholders, including contributing the colony's militia and sending slaves to build public works, used similarly gender-neutral language, specifically taking into account female owners. Female slave ownership existed and was acknowledged, in fact, because so many male heads of households died prematurely amidst the instability of colonial life. Some women gained unprecedented economic autonomy through it. These women independently managed large plantations, and freely bought, sold, bequeathed and hired slaves, which gave them the financial status to play important public roles within their communities. Well aware that the Southern patriarchy was generally hostile to female autonomy, Such single slave-holding women protected their precarious privilege by replicating the same racist hierarchies that enabled Southern slavery, slave mastery. It was not limited to the unmarried. Wealthy women entered marriage with slaves gifted to them by parents, and though legally, wives' persons and property, enslaved or otherwise, belonged to their husbands, the reality was more nuanced. Some mistresses distinguished between their own and husband's slaves. Former slave Silas Glenn remembered his mistress being good to the slaves that come into her from her daddy, but mean to those from her husband's side. Many firmly resisted their husband's attempts at managing, disciplining, or selling their enslaved property. White women who had grown up commanding slaves gained an internalized understanding of themselves as slaveholders, replete with the associated rights and responsibilities, and did not hesitate to assert this sense of independent ownership within their marriages. Some, such as Mrs. Annie Poor, who sold slaves for big prices after she'd trained them in specialized skills like cooking and carpentry, were acute businesswomen, true mistresses of the market. Such women studied slave prices, exploited market fluctuations, and, contrary to popular belief, personally attended auctions, or hired male representatives to conduct such business on their behalf. In sum, both single and married slave-holding women gained economic power and personal agency within a repressive patriarchal system through the ownership and oppression of enslaved persons, whom they considered, first and foremost, as their property. Brutal lives of female slaves. Secondly, while sources do not suggest that witnessing the sexual abuse of female slaves turned mistresses into sympathetic allies, it was actually quite the contrary. Powerless to stop men's transgressions and suffocated by the hypocritical ideals of female purity thrust upon them, most turned a complicit blind eye or further abused the victims. Diarist and slave mistress Mary Boykin Chestnut, for instance, could call slavery a wrong and an inequity for the sexual disorder it produced and characterize female slaves as prostitutes in the same sentence. Mistresses such as Boykin Chestnut self-pityingly casted themselves as the sole victims of white men's actions, while extending little sympathy towards the enslaved victims. Instead, many reproduced racist stereotypes of black women as animalistic, hypersexual, and complicit in their own abuse. Boykin Chestnut felt faint, seasick, witnessing a mulatto woman being sold for sexual purposes, but described the woman as lasciviously ogling the bidders with an expanded grin of excitement. Others, especially on smaller plantations where mistresses were constantly confronted with evidence of their husband's infidelity, took their anger out on victims. In his famed autobiographical narrative, Solomon Northup remembers witnessing an enslaved woman named Patsy being literally flayed due to her mistress' jealousy. The mistress often persuaded her husband or other slaves to whip Patsy out of spite, and even attempted to bribe Northup to murder her. As Natalie Zaczek notes, though some have framed such erratic, emotionally motivated violence as somehow less severe than the systematic abuse often associated with masters, its unpredictable nature likely terrorized and traumatized slaves. Thus, most mistresses' reactions to sexual abuse ultimately perpetuated the larger culture of racialized violence inherent to Southern slavery, maternal slavery. Mistresses themselves exploited enslaved bodies in various ways. Emily West and Rosie J. Knight used the thriving market for enslaved wet nurses to highlight how mistresses manipulated and commodified enslaved women's mothering to serve their own needs. Mistresses' reasons for employing wet nurses ranged from illness to vanity, the fear that feeding would make their breast fall and become less aesthetically pleasing. Unlike slaves, mistresses had the privilege of choice in the matter, and their decisions determined the nature of enslaved women's mothering. Harriet Jacobs, for example, remembers her mother being weaned at 3 months old, so that the babe of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. Thus, mistresses placed their own desires and their children's nutritional needs above enslaved women's bodily autonomy, a uniquely gendered form of maternal violence. Moreover, while many fretted in personal writings about their own nursing-related worries, not one reflected on the physical or emotional toll of forcing an enslaved mother to set aside her child for theirs. Mistresses also continually interfered in enslaved women's parenting. Some supervised pregnancies, ministering home remedies, designating certain slaves to act as midwives, and occasionally deciding where births would occur. While this could be considered benevolent assistance, we cannot know how enslaved women felt about such intrusions into their bodies and intimate experiences. Neither was their interest in slaves' reproduction wholly altruistic. A healthy child was a valuable commodity who could later be separated from their family and sold for profit. In some, as Jones Rogers argues, shared female experiences like motherhood did not cause mistresses to radically transcend societal norms. These instead became arenas where mistresses reconstructed racialized hierarchies to enforce their own privilege and power. White women on plantations. Some white women also participated in the sexual abuse of male slaves. According to Thomas Balcerski, the conditions that fostered abuse between white men and enslaved women, the availability of enslaved bodies, sex as a means of maintaining hierarchies of race and power, also led to similar contact between mistresses and enslaved men. He notes that contemporary observers remarked quite offhandedly about this, for example Harriet Jacobs, who claims that seeing how female slaves were subject to their father's authority in all things, some mistresses learned to exercise the same authority. Jacobs remembers a woman who chose the most brutalized slave on her plantation as a partner, knowing she could most completely exercise her power over him and evade the risk of capture. Admittedly, such relationships were a minority, but this example displays how white women understood, strategically used and often reenacted the hierarchies of race, sex and power around them. Importantly, sexualized abuse did not necessarily entail rape. Morgan comments that even daily encounters possessed a perversely sexual dimension, in the South, because some enslaved people were forced to wear little or no clothing. The display of particularly black male bodies in the presence of upper-class white women drew startled remarks from Northern observers, like one William Harding, who noted seeing enslaved men wearing only a loose shirt, descending halfway down their thighs waiting on ladies who did not express any apparent embarrassment. Other violations of privacy included mistresses beating unclothed slaves, much in the same way masters did, or ordering them to massage or perform other intimate ministrations on their bodies. Some white women secured silence afterwards by threatening to accuse enslaved men of having raped them if they revealed anything, indicating that like their menfolk, they recognized and manipulated social stereotypes associating blackness with sexual aggression. Taken together, such examples exhibit how white women gained a certain transgressive power in a society that denied them sexual agency through the domination and violation of enslaved bodies. Thanks for watching. Do like, subscribe and comment.